As Head of Creative Service at Sound Alliance, our next guest, Stig Richards, knows a thing or two about the younger generation. So he's going to talk to you about what they do at Sound Alliance. So this is kind of up to 1.5 million youth and others are their audience every month with a range of ways that they publish and produce, but it's online, so it's a lot of ways to think about how they do this. There's a man, I don't know if he's set up, he's ready to go. He's good, he says. Now, Stig, by the way, I was shocked to find out there's already another Stig at the Australia Day National Conference, and that Shanika's young son, Shanika Fernando, one of our local heroes who was here yesterday speaking, his young son is called Stig. And Stig was kind of happy.
I'm flattered. We're a rare breed, in actual fact.
That's right. So he's also, this is a guy, while you're setting up, he loves this because he's also, I said, oh, well, of course, the name Stig has become synonymous with car racing. He said, well, I do that too. So this, this bloke, he's got a label, but he connects with the youth. And the key thing is, we're going to find out about how this all works, because it is really this, it is online, and it's how you engage with people over and over again. And Stig, we've heard about this over the last day and a half about how we engage, and we know about maybe putting up a tweet or maybe putting a Facebook, but you're talking about content and making it rich content that people want to keep coming back to. But we're going to hear all about it.
There will be an awful lot about content, about social media and about various other things, but I'll do it briefly.
You do this. You take over. Let's give Stig a round of applause, everybody. Stig, to the stage, everybody.
Okay. No, I'm pretty good. Firstly, oh, it's not displaying? Okay, give it a wiggle. That's a technical term, by the way. And I'll try it again, and...
We've just gone from Mac to PC, and, these things always, usually there's a station break, an ad break, but of course...
We're still not displaying, by the way.
We haven't got it up yet. Can we summarise...
Metaphorically.
Can we summarise a little bit before we... Here we go, it's coming. We're getting the switch through now. We're just going through...
There we go.
Anyway, thanks to the BBC for that one. Thanks so much. Here we go.
First thing, I want to thank the organisers of the Australia Day conference for having me. I don't want to thank them for putting me on after Peter Fitzsimons. Or before lunch, which is probably the second best thing that will happen today. Frankly speaking, it's not fair. But I do know something now whenever anybody asks me if I'll talk at something, the first thing I need to ask is Peter Fitzsimons talking, and can I please be before him? I actually asked him beforehand if he could please not be very good. Obviously, he let me down. It gets worse, to be perfectly honest, because I'm talking about market research, which is inherently dull, and I'm doing it in PowerPoint. So, if it's any consolation, you just had the best bit of the day. I'll be the worst bit, then it'll be lunch, and it'll be better in the afternoon. I'll just clarify a couple of things. So I'm going to be presenting a whole bunch of research and one or two opinions. The company that I work for is a company called Sound Alliance. We're the biggest independent publisher of digital content for young people. Our audience it's actually, I think you said 1.5 million. It's sort of 2 to 2.5 million nowadays with the launch of a couple of titles recently. This is 4 titles that we produce and output through mobile device, website, social media, so on and so forth. Hopefully you know some of them. If you don't, it doesn't really matter, because looking around, there's some people in the target demo, some people aren't. Everything we do is targeted at young Australians, essentially. That doesn't mean that's our entire audience, but that's everyone that we focus on. And we used to generate content, produce content around areas of interest, and then sell advertising around that. That was our business model. But things are kind of changing really fast for technology, for content consumption, for content distribution. And one of the things that we do now is we help brands to tell and share their stories. It's become our business model, if you like. You might have heard about native content. In actual fact, you guys, sort of collectively, as Australia Day or the Australian of the Year Awards are actually doing some native content at the moment with one of our titles, which is a way of producing content but putting it in front of an audience that actually want to engage with that content, rather than the old model of display advertising where you try to basically get someone to click on something they don't really want to click on and then migrate away to somewhere they never wanted to be to get your brand message. So our model is try and put things in the place that people already want to spend some time. Just quickly on our business, we've recently been awarded for quite a lot of our work in that way that until you win awards, you think awards are completely irrelevant, and then you get one and you can't stop talking about them. We were last year's Umbrella Media Brand of the Year with Junkee. We were Publisher of the Year at the Festival of Brands Entertainment. And 6 months ago, we launched another, what we call a native publication with Qantas, which is this thing here, which is AWOL. It's sort of a mobile first, but also digital and also social platform for distributing content that hopefully inspires young people to travel. And we do it entirely in partnership with Qantas. So it's a JV between us and Qantas. And just as I said, the awards don't matter until you get them. Last week we won the Umbrella Award for Content Marketing Strategy of the Year. But I wanted you to just sort of understand that a year ago even, Qantas would have had a marketing budget and they would have tried to spend that budget advertising to young people. Now what they're doing is creating content for young people, putting it in a place that young people are happy to spend time, putting it in a format that young people are happy to share, and then they get the subsequent benefit of flight bookings further down the track. So that's a little bit of my business, if you like. Each year, to make sure that we know what we're on about, we conduct one of the biggest market research pieces on our target audience, because frankly I'm not in the target demographic anymore, so I need to make sure that we sort of stay on top of what young people are actually thinking. To prove that it's proper research, I've got a few slides on the background and methodology. So we've actually been doing research every year for 7 years, but the last 3 years we've made a really concerted effort to start measuring change over those 3 years. We do it with a company called Pollinate, which is a Sydney-based research company, very experienced, very established, they really know what they're doing. I give them the brief. I actually worked there 9 years ago, but that's another story. And then let them do all the work. They present it back to us, and we try and turn it into insights that are relevant both for our business and for our clients, whether they be Qantas or whether they be the Australian of the Year Awards. So it's a 25-minute online survey that every year it's between 1,000 and 2,000 respondents that we actually grab the data from. Like I said, I'm jumping ahead on my script, but for the last 3 years we've been tracking changes because the rate of change is kind of the theme of the next half an hour, 40 minutes I'm going to talk about. But the research, what it's allowed us to do for the last few years is sort of diagnose sort of crippling acronyms like FOMO and FONC. I could go into a whole half an hour on each of those, but I won't. We've diagnosed infobesity, this idea that young people nowadays, and perhaps all of us to some extent, are snacking on small bits of information rather than delving really deeply into topics like we might have done in the past. We've discovered the effects of journalism, where in a lot of instances now the things that we turn to for real news are actually just reproducing other people's news or reproducing press releases rather than actually having the journalistic integrity or strength or resources to dig deeply into them themselves. We urge brands to fish where the fish are, that is, not have them migrate away to somewhere that people don't want to go after measuring a click-through rate that no one's interested in. Identify this notion that young people are living their lives a mile wide and an inch deep. This thing is, they are the most best educated generation we've ever had. However, most of what they consume and most of what they know about, they know at this sort of veneer level. They know a little bit about a lot of things rather than a lot about a few things. We do a lot of work in social media, and I'll bore you with some of that shortly. And we've also labelled the current generation both generation content and generation content, which is really good if it's spoken out loud, but terrible if you put it into print. And we do this essentially by listening. So it's nice to think that we know what's going on. The research project that we do each year is designed to sort of get our audience to tell us what they know about youth. And when you've got 2.5 million youth as your audience each month, you're pretty much getting a good litmus test of Australia. This is the demographic split of what I'm presenting to you today. So whenever there's a chart or a graph, it's based on this demographics. We do have data outside of this, but you need to chop it somewhere. And we essentially have a 50-50 male-female skew after we've chopped out the bias that might have happened in the total sample. In essence, my brief is to find out who thinks what and why and how it's changing over time. I also try, when I do a presentation like this, to provide a bit of context. And the best context I can give, I think, for what I'm about to present is like a generational context. So first of all, I'm going to look, not in very much depth, so just bear with me, but at what it was like or what opportunities there were if you were a youth growing up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. First of all, if you think of the baby boomers who were born sort of end of World War II into the mid-60s, they were the first generation that really had the opportunity or the freedom to protest. They were given a voice, if you like, a musical voice at least, by radio. Prior to that, there was no single medium that could really sort of focus in on youth as a group. They popularised the beatniks that had been around a little bit before that, but they also created mods, rockers, hippies, latter boomers were the first punks and so on. They gave birth to sort of music/cultural movements like disco, glam rock, and early new age. Most interestingly, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, but they sort of returned to conservatism by their middle age, and thanks to negative gearing, they now own all the houses. If you step forward a little bit to Gen X, my generation, obviously the best of the generations, born from the mid-60s to the mid-80s, the kids of the baby boomers, they were sort of considered disaffected and directionless by their parents at least, but they were really just exercising a newfound independence that hadn't existed before. They could, in musical subcultural terms, become new romantics or ravers or grunge kids and so on. And they were also the first to be exposed to technology as youngsters. So it was the digital watch or the VCR player that their parents couldn't program that ended up in the hands of an 8-year-old that could. And that's kind of accelerated somewhat if you go to the present generation and the focus of today's talk, which is millennials or Gen Y, or sometimes called digital natives. They're the first generation that everything around them has been technological in some way, and they're living through this period of acceleration. And that, again, is part of the theme of what I'll talk about. But so that was, if you like, generations. We've gone baby boomers, we've gone Gen Y, and then we're talking about millennials. Let's have a look briefly at the year that they had, and this is some of the articulation of events that they were noticing last year, but it's also the year that we all had, depending on which things we were paying attention to. This is a pictorial representation of the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, which I'm sure everybody saw something of, whether they wanted to or not. 2014 also saw the creation of a new social network called Ello that for about a fortnight everyone was interested in and wondered whether it was going to be bigger than Facebook. No, is the simple answer. But the fact that something new came along that made people ask the question is still relevant. Perhaps excuse the next slide. The Kim Kardashians supposedly broke the internet to the extent that this got fed into our research quite substantially last year. And in less substantial news, U2 put a virus on everybody's computer, and then Apple had to release a patch to remove it. Proving that karma is a thing. Bono then had a bike accident and may never play the guitar again, which sort of is, they're perhaps the things that didn't necessarily, and probably mattered to Bono, but didn't necessarily matter to everybody. In some of the things that did matter, there were a couple of things happened to Malaysian Airlines that were they were unimaginable. There was conflict in the Ukraine, there was the annexation of Crimea, there's horrors in Syria, and in no surprise to everyone, the Middle East is still in turmoil. Tony Abbott happened. I've got another commentary for that, but I might save it for a different audience because I think I know where your funding comes from. So in other news, the selfie stick became acceptable, and proving that science fiction can sometimes be a good predictor of fact, some people got real working bionic arms, at least good enough to pick up a cherry tomato, which I didn't actually know was the prime objective of technology, but ably demonstrated there. In sporting news, there was a football World Cup, which is amazingly topical right now, but it was won by a country called Germany, whoever they are. But I was born in 1968. The last time the country that needs to win the World Cup won the World Cup was 2 years before I was born. I'm now probably more than halfway through my life, and there's a real risk that I might now go my entire life without seeing a World Cup in England's hands, which is a tragedy, I assure you. So that's the context. So we've looked at where the generations have come from. We've looked at the last 12 months, and now we had, I'm going to show you some charts. I've warned you it goes downhill. We had a question, do any of the following currently concern you? And we've been asking this question for a number of years. So the first one I'm going to present, the first chart here, is the green is the most recent study, and what's it looking like on your screen? The cream is the year before. So there's a year between these two things. What you'll notice is that these things didn't change at all. That's deliberate. But they are still things that were of significant concern. Personal issues like career, finance, health, very me topics, are very concerning, but haven't changed very much over the 12 months between the research dips. So what has changed? Well, over the past 12 months, or the 12 months between the research dips, the things that have increased the most are the areas of social, global, or national significance. Now, this is quite important because over the last few years, research that we've done has shown not necessarily an ambivalence, but a certain lack of engagement with big topics, like the macro topics, the global things like climate and government and so on. But now what we've seen is, just in a 12-month span, we've seen a huge shift in those bigger issues: social equality, climate change, government. Government went from basically sort of 54% and around about sort of 15 in the list of potential things you could be worried about. It's gone sort of shot up the charts with a bullet to number 3, which is great if you're an album and not so great if you're a government. But it's also causing young people to think about these things, which I think is relevant, because in the past they hadn't, or for a while they hadn't. Similarly, on some of the sort of psychological factors that we measured, and there's going to reach a point here where there's going to be lots of different bits of data that you're probably going to struggle to process while I talk about them, so I'll share the deck afterwards for everybody. But on this one here, we wanted to know how young people are feeling, is my mic coming in and out? I'm not sure, about their place in the world. So compared to other countries, and here is Australians my age have relatively better access to education, employment and healthcare. And when you take the top 2 boxes, which is the blue and the green, 91% of young people are acknowledging that as a truth, which I think is great. There is a realisation that we live in a wonderful country with great opportunity. Similarly, we see really positive results for people acknowledging that they're relatively unaffected by hardships like economic downturns, war, terrorism, natural disasters and disease. Not only, I mean, is that a fact that we are relatively unaffected, but this is young people identifying that they're unaffected, and against the year before, that's risen by 10%. Okay, so that's more people recognising better that they've got it good, if I summarise it so succinctly. So you'd think that logically, with those 2 pieces of realisation, that they are feeling maybe happier, less stressed, more positive in general. But on the question, are you feeling, or was it exactly, relatively stress-free, over the same year, we saw less people, 6% less respondents claiming to feel stress-free, despite more acknowledgement of how good they've got it. So it's kind of a conundrum in there. And look, sometimes the research gives you really good insight, and sometimes it just worries you because you can't come up with the why. Do I need a new mic? Have you heard anything I've said? I'll just check. Is my channel up on this one? No? I can shout. I can use these ones. And not wander around so much. Okay. So I can't. Am I all right at the moment? No. Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment, but I'll try and be better from now. Okay. Lectern? Okay. I'll lean in and try and read my notes. So to summarise that quickly, young Australians are increasingly aware that they've got better education, employment, healthcare than their counterparts overseas, increasingly aware that they're distant from the world's worst issues, but they're increasingly stressed. Okay? I don't know, it's not a great story, and it's not one that I can answer, but it's something that needs to be considered. Similarly, exploring some different questions and different metrics, and tracking changes in anxiety and... Oh, and none of the plans, right. There we go. I can be normal. So this is, just to give you the methodology, this is 2-box questions. So people were presented with a series of things, and they had to say whether they were anxious or carefree, whether they were glass half empty, glass half full. And you can see over the last 3 years of data, here on those 2 fairly negative things, they're increasing. People are becoming more anxious. They're becoming more pessimistic. Now, I sometimes look at this data and try to find positives when it's negative, and And it's true that correlation doesn't prove cause, but there is nonetheless an interesting correlation here, which is that over the same period of time, people answering the question whether they are progressive or traditional are stating that they're becoming increasingly progressive. I think that's probably quite notable for things like the Republican movement, for example. But it's also, is this something that starts to sow the seeds of rebellion or revolution or creative, innovative solutions to problems, whether they be bigger issues or whether they be business issues? But it's also important that young people actually start to take action when they're young. And that's borne out by this bit of data, which is the x-axis here is age, and the y-axis is attributes that people gave about themselves. And what you can see is that the older you get, although when you're 30, you're not old, but you're older than you were when you were 16, the data shows that you become less progressive, less ambitious, your moral values wane, and you cease to be as accepting, which is a bit of a concern. Or to put it into more sort of internet meme terms, the older you get, the grumpier you get, which may or may not be a good thing. I have to cut this presentation down. It was an hour and a half when I did it to someone else yesterday, and I've got about 40 minutes, or about 20 minutes thanks to Peter. But so this is possibly not the best segue into work, because obviously everyone loves the job, but we had a series of questions about what people think about what they're going to spend an awful lot of their time doing. And basically here, the question was, my job career needs to be something that I enjoy doing. 93% of young people stated that it needed to be something that they enjoyed doing, which is good. I mean, it's good to aspire to earning a living doing something you enjoy doing. However, when we asked them if they would accept a well-paid job, even if it wasn't something that they enjoyed doing, more than half said they would. So the outtake's pretty clear that your idealism is for sale. But thankfully, there are 10% of people here who did say quite vehemently that no, on the contrary, I need to stick with something that I enjoy doing, which probably just means no one's ever going to offer them a job for more money. So that's the psychological stuff. Now I'm going to get back to this notion of passing time and how fast things are changing. And I'm going to fly through about a dozen slides now, and I just want you very briefly think about your interaction with some of these things, okay? Think of YouTube, for example, and the types of video that you consume nowadays. Think of Instagram, if you use it, and the way that you visually communicate. And what I mean there is not taking photos to save for the future, but snap, share, and think about the fact that now most young people, maybe all of us or a lot of us, have taken thousands of photos that we'll never look at again. We've just taken it to note a moment in time for somebody else. So, for example, I sent a picture from the back of the room earlier when Peter was talking for my wife, saying this isn't going to go well. And I'll never look at that photo again, partly due to the trauma, but also because that's how you now treat photos. Similarly, think of Facebook and how many of your connections, both to people and to information, flow through Facebook, and I've got a bit of data on that shortly. Think of Uber, and how in no time at all, in some cities at least in Australia, the words become synonymous with transport. It's actually been faster to become a verb than Google was. So now you think of Googling things as a verb, and now people start to talk about getting sort of Ubering things, but Uber's done it quicker than even Google did. Uber, Google, it just sounds like I'm talking nonsense. Think of your Kindle, if you have a Kindle or a Kindle app on your smartphone or whatever, and how you now read on the beach and maybe paper's a thing of the past. Think of your iPhone or your iPad or whatever iDevice you use. Think of the likes of BuzzFeed, Junkee, one of our titles, had to slip in a plug, Huffington Post, Mamma Mia, the types of media titles that now deliver the content that you engage with or you consume each day. If you're a music lover, think of the way that you now consume music, whether it be Spotify, RDO, Pandora, SoundCloud, Mixcloud, all of your options. And think of the likes of Netflix. Very, very new in Australia. Tailoring your TV consumption, but delivering it to whatever device, whatever screen is closest at hand. Now, here's some facts about those things. All well-known brands, all successful products, all less than 11 years old. Okay, now, there would be 10, which would make for a much nicer statistic, except for the fact that Facebook is now 11. All reliant on or benefiting from mobile devices, and all delivering content except Uber delivers you. Now, again, I'm going to give more context and then I'll get to more charts. Think of television. Looked at from a historical point of view, mainstream television launched in Australia 16th of September 1956. It took 19 years for an upgrade to colour, okay? 19 years, and you still had to walk across the room to change channel. Looked at more historically, I'm sort of going broader here, if you like. The Gutenberg press came about in 1440, revolutionised the way that information could spread, en masse. It was another 360 years before there was electricity. It was another 100 years before you had a car you could drive or a prototype aeroplane. Then it was another 50 years for TV, another 20 years for colour. In recent years, the ways that we find, consume, share information, make connections with people, leverage technology have exploded. In my office, we have this terrible habit of coming up with words to amuse ourselves, and the term that we came up with for this is techceleration. We love it. One day we think we can make money out of making up words. We just haven't quite worked it out yet. But it's obviously it's unprecedented, but and I'm sure you're all familiar with Moore's law, which is this notion that processing power multiplies by a factor of 2 every 18 months, and storage capacity increases and cost of storage shrinks and so on. It's happening across the board in all areas of technology. And the biggest culprit or beneficiary of all of that technological acceleration, if you like, is mobile phones, mobile devices. I don't know whether you can call it a phone necessarily nowadays, because being a telephone is probably the least used thing, or the least amount of activity you spend with your phone. And so firstly, a couple of statistics. On iPhone 6 launch weekend, Apple sold more transistors than had existed on Earth up until 1995. I don't have a slide for this, but also not even the current iPhone, but an older iPhone, the 3S, I think it was the statistic the man from Intel told me, but has more processing power than the whole room full of computers and banks of processors that put Neil Armstrong on the moon and brought him back again. One phone that has been superseded by whatever all of you have got now, because if any of you have got a 3, well done. It was when it was still a nice shape that could fit in your pocket. Other things to give you an idea of just how important the mobile is, because it is in financial terms, this is Facebook's revenue, okay? You can see that when they IPO'd, they'd been thinking that they were a desktop social media and that they were a desktop advertising solution, their business would have stagnated, their share price would have tanked, and they wouldn't have a business anymore. But they knew what they were doing, and they knew that mobile was where the money was going to come, and they knew that that's what everybody was going to start doing more and more of. So there's their revenue, the important bit, mobile advertising going through the roof. Everything else is pretty much the same as it's always been. A similar shaped graph, sadly with far less money in it. This is my business traffic. The red line is the amount of traffic that we get, or the content that we deliver to mobile devices, and the blue is desktop. So blue's all right. I mean, we can still serve ads on it, and it's still reasonable for us, and some people still like it, and it's what people do when they're sitting at their desk supposedly working. But it's mobile where our business has grown. So whether you work in media, marketing, entertainment, content, communication, gaming, the arts, whatever it happens to be, if you want to innovate or you want to succeed in or disrupt an existing industry, you pretty much need to be thinking about the role that mobile can play. So if you need to communicate with people, you need to think about optimizing for mobile in one way or another. Consider, there's a meme that did the rounds recently, and I've tried to make it look slightly better than it did in most people's Facebook feeds. But in 2015, Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles at all. Alibaba, the world's biggest retailer, has no inventory of its own. Airbnb, which is now the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate. And Facebook, the world's most visited media, creates no content. They are all mammoth businesses that simply serve the conduit from one person to another, and they almost exclusively do it through mobile devices. Sure, they've got desktop versions, but it's the mobile where they win. With Facebook here, this is a fairly elegant segue into social media and content. First thing, just because I think it's interesting and I've got the mic, social media, it's not about social anymore. It's become a misnomer. It's like stream of consciousness meets stream of content. Sure, you can post stuff and you can publish your stuff, but you're sharing other stuff. Content's coming to you, you've liked certain pages, your friends are liking and sharing certain pages, and so it's this stream of content, and it's the first place that most people go when they either open their smartphone or switch on their computer and open a browser. But it also comes with a dash of insecurity. I did have several slides on the insecurity part, but I'm sort of curtailed by time, and I'm looking at the clock, and I'm probably going to go over it. But I was asked to Mumbrella, knowing I can get a bit verbose, asked me to describe Facebook in as few words as possible. It's a challenge, but for me, it was that Facebook is something you have to do, and everything else is just for fun. But that's not to disparage Facebook. It's not that people dislike it. In previous presentations, we've talked about the fact that there's always been these headlines about Facebook's not cool anymore and so on and so forth. It doesn't need to be. Water isn't cool, I'm still going to drink it today. Air isn't cool, I'm still going to breathe it. It's just the place that you go to get the stuff that is cool or is interesting. It's just what's written at the top of the page and that serves you the ads and gets all the money. So you just have to think about it in those terms rather than something that needs to be buzzy. To see it against other things, and this has got an awful lot of data on it, this is the various things that might be called social media, or at least digital communication, plotted against one another in terms of red, if you can't read it, is used more than once a day. The pale blue is using about once a day. So if we just focus on those things, up the top is Facebook, and you can see that over the last 3 years, 92, 93, 95% of people, this is young people, young Australians 16 to 30, are using Facebook every single day. The really interesting one, and I say this to brands, and I've said to record labels, and pretty much anyone that's ever heard me talk, is email. See, and the way that this question was actually phrased was email for personal use. Because obviously a lot of us have to use email for work, but the question didn't fit on the slide, but was email for personal use. And you can see that we've got 45% of people using it multiple times. More importantly, you've got 75% of people using it every single day. Now, the number of people using it is less important than the data. So if you can, in your organizations and your planning, build an email database, no one can take that away from you. You can measure the data, you can measure the success of the data of what you put into an email, you can see what people click on, when they click on it, whether they go through to purchase or whether they go to book a ticket. You can measure almost everything with email, and you own the data, and no one can put the price up. So Facebook is very, very good at making things really, really cheap and getting you hooked, and then they put the price up on things. Again, I don't have an issue with that. They're a successful business. They're allowed to do that, and we use them an awful lot. But email stays yours. Your email database is something you can leverage if you have the opportunity to build one. Other ones of interest, because like Instagram, again, can be very, very powerful. Obviously, it doesn't have the functionality of Facebook, and Facebook own it, so they're never going to let it be a threat, but it's very, very useful. I always try and pull out something interesting from down the bottom. I could ask, although I probably won't get a show of hands, but how many people here either know of or use Tinder? See, it was you. It was the chucklers. But 2% of people confess to using Tinder multiple times a day, for which I can either admire their stamina or pity their desperation. I'm not sure which. For those that don't know Tinder, you'll have to ask the person sitting next to you. In terms of usage over age, and again, this is interesting and something to factor depending on your specific activities. And I'll confess, I know a bit about I know a bit about Australia Day and the Australian of the Year Awards and so on, but I know that there's a lot of different disciplines represented here. But if you look here left to right over ages, you can see which things are being used more by different groups. And you can see that Facebook and Twitter are basically sort of equal across age groups. You'd certainly rather be Facebook from the amount of usage. But the ones that are interesting, but probably I won't go into detail in this forum, is the likes of Snapchat. A lot of young people are using Snapchat, but what Snapchat has to do is stay relevant, keep its users, and keep recruiting. Otherwise, it'll be a sort of flash-in-the-pan thing that just becomes a data play rather than a fundamental powerhouse in social media or content distribution terms. Similarly, we ask questions, because it's fundamental to our business, about how people discover content online. And if you take from this the fact that Facebook newsfeed wins, I think that was always going to be obvious. But in third place, shares from friends, and in fifth place, sites you've liked, are actually different ways of articulating Facebook. You can see that in this graph alone, Facebook came first, third, and fifth. But I've got other statistics to mirror that with, and this is the significance of news. We've had this question for 3 years running about, I get more of my news from social media than from newspapers, radio, or TV. It's very clearly worded about content that you could get, if you like, in an official news format. So this isn't social news. This isn't a picture of your friend's puppy. This is actual news. In 2013, it was 53%, which kind of shocked us a little bit that it was more than half. But then by 2014, it had gone up to 65%, and by 2015, it was up to 77% of young people getting most of their news, more of their news through social media than through what you might call traditional sources. But there's a bit of self-realization coming in, and we asked this question, or presented this statement, and people get to say yes or no to it. My friends and I are on social media too much. I sometimes make this a quiz and ask the room, but I'm already running over time. So 56% of people in 2014 said they were using it too much, and a year later, 62% of young people saying they're using it too much. Also had questions about whether people had done social media detox. If you read between the lines of the response, it looks like quite a lot of people feel the need for it. Quite a lot of people have done it, but only some people are willing to admit it. By that, I mean we had 35% of people say they'd had one, but 58% of people said they knew someone that had had one. So read into that what you like. We also, maybe we just do this to amuse ourselves, but we ask people to respond to this statement. When I'm on the toilet, I usually use my mobile phone. If you consider the fact that when people are on the toilet, they're probably not making phone calls, what this actually means is when you're on the toilet, are you looking at other people's Facebook status updates? And it was, yes, 56% of people usually look at your Facebook status updates while sitting on the toilet. So just think about the material you post next time and who your audience is. We also wanted to know if there's battery anxiety, if such a thing exists. And so they had to respond to this. I feel anxious when my phone has run out of battery. 52% of people, more than half of the people that responded, said that they feel anxious, which is, a bit of an alarm, especially if they've run out of battery and they need to go to the toilet. It's a modern-day horror story. And now, so on this one, most valued possessions, and you can see that it's no surprise, phone comes in at number one. In the interest of time, I'll skip most and point out that clothes come in at number 5, indicating that most people are comfortable with nudity provided they've got a phone. I did spend some time on the internet trying to find an appropriate picture for that, but after several hours of looking at nude photos on the internet, I just couldn't find the right one. Got distracted. So we know so I treat this like therapy. So we know that the phone is the most important thing. Okay, it's the most important possession that they have. But there's actually something that's more important. And every year, for the last few years, we've asked this question, which do you value more? Experiences or possessions? And in 2013, 93% of people said that they valued experiences more than possessions. In 2014, 93% of people said they valued experiences more than possessions. Anyone want to guess 2015? It's a trick question. 2015, 93. So we've sort of reached this critical mass of appreciation of experiences over possessions. And I think that's really important. I think it's probably more important to this room than it is to a lot of the presenting that I do, because a lot of the presenting I do is people that are trying to sell stuff. And here you're actually trying to present community or create community. I can see you standing there. I'm struggling for time, aren't I? Okay. So I'm going to have to go even faster. But the most valuable experience, the thing that people seek the most, is the thing that is both an experience that can then be shared, and that is travel. And it's the clear number one in everything we ask, whether it's an open text field or whether it's people ticking boxes. Travel is the number one desired experience. This is a word cloud, so the more responses get the bigger words. So you see that traveling is obviously very big. Travel itself is big. World is obviously related. Even in yellow in the middle, traveling spelt wrong is very popular. Probably says something about our audience. But it's not just the thing they're looking forward to most, it's also the thing they cherish most, which again I think is important because traveling doesn't get old. Just because you've been doesn't mean it's done and dusted. It's probably inspired you to want to travel more, or spell it wrong and travel more, bottom right-hand corner. Quick summary, we know that young people are on the toilet looking at that picture you just posted on Facebook. They're waiting for an Uber to take them to the airport to escape their worries about government and climate change. We know that they're immersed in technology. They're only doing a job they don't like if the money's good and that they're not listening to you too. And I'm going to have to go really, really fast because I'm sure you're all more interested in lunch. But looking at identity now on the basis of all of the data that I've just produced, what happens to individual expression or your identity when all this technology is always changing and all this content is flying at you? Well, in the 60s, you could become a beatnik or a mod or a rocker or a hippie. You could express yourself outwardly. In the 70s, you could be a glam rocker, a punk, a mod revivalist. This is looping back to the beginning of the presentation. Before anyone chimes in, I know this isn't an exhaustive list. It's just some of the options that you had. In the 80s, new romantic, hardcore goth, ravers. In the 90s, you'd added emos, punks were back. Indie had emerged from grunge. But in the present day, or in the past, subcultures helped to define you. You know, they were part of what you were, what you wore, the music you listened to, who you associated with, which record shop you hung out at. I'm talking about me, by the way. But now, as Alex Petrides from The Guardian very succinctly put it, the internet doesn't spawn mass movements bonded together by a shared taste in music, fashion, and ownership of subcultural capital. It spawns brief, microcosmic ones. So the paradox is that the more things change, especially technologically speaking, the more everyone becomes the same. Demonstrated here by many men from all around the world failing to differentiate themselves with facial hair. And obviously it's very easy to take the piss out of hipsters. I work in Surrey Hills. It's like a hobby for me. But the point here is that we don't have a proliferation of subcultures anymore. We used to, and it only died out relatively recently, but it's died out with the advent of constant content, constant social media, sharing and so on, and sitting on the toilet, checking Facebook and so on. It's essentially globalization, but no one uses that term anymore. Now we have this kind of fashion of no fashion, a very short anecdote, I'll make it short as I can, but a satirical market research company popped up about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and came up with the name Normcore to determine this idea of being blandly dressed and not standing out. Now, it was just a bunch of students having a laugh, but they put it out there as if it was a real thing, and a whole bunch of retailers picked up on it in America, and pretty soon there were Normcore ranges being listed in Gap and various other places. The term that the students had come up with, or the phrase they used, was that Normcore moves away from a coolness that relies on difference to a post-authenticity coolness that opts into sameness, which is both the wankiest sentence ever written, but also quite a remarkable reflection on an actual globalized style. It wasn't something that took off. Normcore is something that sort of happened in a vacuum and then got popularized by some clothing retailers. What you have now is that identity exists for people online. It's the content they consume. It's the people that they're linked to, how they share things. People are essentially the sum of their digital parts. That actually sounds like there's lots of fingers. I didn't mean that. But they are a very different thing to they were in the past, where it was all outwardly projected. Now it's digitally projected, if you like. So what we've tried to do, and I've only got a couple of slides left, thankfully, but is provide some rules of adaptation. So very quickly, rules of adaptation, and this is thinking of the problem of technology and communicating with young people specifically. Firstly, ignoring a problem isn't going to make it go away. If you think of newspapers who spent a long time ignoring digital, and by the time they jumped onto digital, they hadn't noticed the fact that everyone was looking at the content on a mobile phone. If you put your head in the sand, it's just going to get worse, or by the time you put it out, it's going to have got worse. Number two, work with people who think change is normal. Okay, and that doesn't have to mean young people, but often it does. We as a business have changed our content model, our revenue model, our technical platform. You know, in our 14 years is our total history, but you know, in the last 10 years, we've just kept on changing, tried to recognize where things were going and changed as a result. And we seek to work with smart, young, creative people because for them it's completely normal. Number three, just because everything is changing doesn't mean you have to change everything. Okay, and it's very dangerous if you think, oh my God, everything's going social media, or I've got to just do social media, or everything's going this, I've just got to do that. Look at what works for you. If you need to take a step back, take a step back. Don't change everything too fast. Just make sure you change the right things. See creativity, not just credentials. To paraphrase that a different way, credentials is what you did well. Having good creativity is what you will do well. Okay, so one looks backwards, one looks forwards. Finally, for the rules, change is good, or even if it isn't, you haven't got a choice. So you've got to go along with it. And I'm going to finish on a quote because it's always good to finish presentations on a quote, and they always make you look smarter than you are. This one is speaking of survival, and it references Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, and it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And I have gone slightly over, but that is the end. Thank you very much. Thank you.